Namaste. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. My guest today is Matt McManus. Matt is a professor of political and international relations at the University of Tec de Monterrey. He completed his PhD in socio-legal studies in 2017, and he has two books coming out, one on international law and another on postmodern conservatism. I'll give you guys a brief idea of how I came across Matt's work. So, as everybody knows, if you're on the internet these days, and I mean, even if you follow politics or the socio-cultural, manthan, as we say it in Sanskrit, in the West, you cannot ignore Jordan Peterson. And I read Jordan Peterson's books and I was reading a lot of his articles, but I was not able to find out a very good critique of Jordan Peterson. And then suddenly I came across some really good writings on marianwest.com where Matt had written three critiques of Jordan Peterson's views. And the best thing that I found out about that was none of them had a single ad hominem. They were not about what Jordan Peterson is as a person. They were all about what Jordan Peterson talks about. And I was like, I have to, talk to Matt and understand where he's coming from in detail. So Matt, welcome to the podcast and thanks a lot for doing this.
No, thank you very much as well. It's always nice to meet another York alumni from around the world.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Matt and I both are from York University. So Matt, my first question is this. What do you make of the whole Jordan Peterson phenomenon? I mean, why do you think Jordan Peterson has become as big as he is right now in the West?
Well, I think the answer in part is best explained by Mark Fisher and his book Capitalist Realism for Zero Books in 2009, where he talks about how at the end of the Cold War, there was this brief moment of triumphalism, as, at least for many, there was this Fukuyama sense that we'd reached the end of history and liberal democracy was triumphalist. But as Fukuyama himself pointed out, the kind of problem with these end of history narratives and the sensibility associated with them was that we kind of realized that this is all that there is now. Western democracy, at least for a time, seemed like the only game in town. And with that came an associated set of values, an emphasis on consumerism, an emphasis certainly on secularism, this idea that the pointed orientation of life is participating in market society and pursuing your own individual sense of pleasure. And what I think Peterson has done very effectively is tap into the ennui or the alienation that's resulted from this kind of society and provided a lot of people with a sense of direction. There can be more in a liberal capitalist context than just mindlessly pursuing your pleasure. And he captured this very nicely in one of his YouTube videos where he talks about how the point of life isn't happiness. It's about more of a kind of striving to overcome certain difficulties. And so I think he's done a good job of catching on to this sense and providing at least some answers that certain people find palatable, even if I myself am not in that group.
Okay, so this is my observation of this whole, saga unfolding is what I've observed is, let's say, the secular humanist movement in the West, and I want your views on my observation. Secular humanism has become successful in the West. So with the of secular humanism, you had a situation where basically the edifice of religion, the structure of society, which was previously bound by the church or loosely, if you don't want to use the word church, it was bound by some religious denomination. Now with the dilution of that religious denomination, there is a gap in society. So do you think Jordan Peterson is filling that gap or some kind of a cultural yearning in the West?
Oh, I would absolutely say so. I mean, there's two ways that this can be connoted. One is in the classic Dostoevskian sense. And you notice that Jordan Peterson refers a lot to Dostoevsky in his work, and that's, of course, not coincidental. Where in the Brothers Karamazov, when discussing the parable of the Grand Inquisitor between Alyosha and Ivan Karamazov, Ivan brings up this idea that without a god, everything is permitted. So you can do whatever it is that you want. And in some senses, this can be taken as one of the maxims underpinning Western liberalism, this idea that you're now free to do as you wish. But of course, the point of the Brothers Karamazov is that this doesn't necessarily lead to satisfaction. If anything, it can lead you to feel deeply unmoored in a now increasingly secular and desacralized world. And I think another way to look at this is the way that Kant and the left-wing philosopher Slavoj Žižek talks about it. That what God provided in a non-secular context wasn't just a framework of rules that you had to follow. What he essentially did was say, you follow these rules and your life will have a certain purpose behind it. And what happens when you remove that sensibility, the sense of meaning, as Peterson would talk about it, is you're left with the sense that, yes, I can do whatever it is that I want, but none of that has any meaning. Even the pursuit of my enjoyment doesn't matter. It doesn't bring any satisfaction except to me. It doesn't contribute anything to the universe. And I think the sense that we're not actually given the kind of heads up to do anything, as Zizek might put it, is a deeply alienating sense that's captured the imagination of a lot of people in Western secular societies today.
So why now, if I was to take this now, what I found, so let's say, I'll take your first article on Merit Invest. Now, what I found in your critique of Jordan Peterson was that you were questioning his how do I put it, how he was portraying the left to be. So where do you think Jordan Peterson has portrayed the left? And I'm using the word left in a loose sense because I don't know how to pinpoint what the left is exactly, because even within the left, there are so many shades in the
Of
West.
course.
So if I'm just using it as a broader, brush. So what do you think Jordan Peterson has, or where has he gone wrong when he says, when you hear Jordan Peterson using these words a lot of times in his videos. He says the Marxists or the social constructivists or the postmodernists. So what do you think is Jordan Peterson's understanding of the left? So like anybody who listens to this, they might not have heard what Jordan Peterson stands for. So I would request you to first say this is what Jordan Peterson stands for, and this is where he has gone wrong.
Okay. Well, I'll make 3 points in kind of ascending order of importance. So kind of move from an academic point to what I think is really the substance of the matter. But I'd like to preface this by saying I do appreciate Peterson's critique of the left in one respect. And that's that I think that the left recently, particularly in a post-Marxist context with the fall of the Soviet Union, turned to a kind of identity politics that had its uses and certainly has contributed a great deal to emancipating many formerly marginalized people. LGBTQ are probably the best example. It was also limited in its ability to capture the imagination of the broader population, and oftentimes presents itself in a very ugly and unnecessarily confrontational manner. And so it's not really surprising, given that there would eventually be a backlash to at least some variants of left-wing thought since the 1990s. But to your point, the first observation I'd like to make is I just don't think from an academic standpoint that Peterson actually understands the left especially well. I mean, if you read his books, Map of Meaning, and especially 12 Rules for Life, he takes a great deal of issue, especially in the latter book, with Marxism or postmodernism, or as he sometimes calls it, postmodern neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism. But the actual references to any authors who are meant to embody these positions are extremely scant. And I'll give you an example from 12 Rules for Life. He has a few pages devoted to talk about why Derrida's work is problematic, but he doesn't actually refer to many, if any, actually, articles, books, or even interviews with Derrida. His main source for critiquing him is a book by Max Horkheimer, who was famously a member of the Frankfurt School, who wrote many decades before Derrida even put pen to paper, and actually, oddly enough, shares many of the same concerns that Peterson himself has about totalitarianism and the psychic underpinning of it. So this is just one example, and I could give you plenty more, but I just don't think that Peterson really knows a lot about what he's talking about when he's pointing the finger at these people. I think he sees a lot of the activists that he intuits or believes are inspired by the work of postmodern neo-Marxists or whatever it happens to be, and just assumes that he can infer the philosophy underpinning that from what he's heard, mainly from secondhand sources and from personal observation. And I just don't think that's a very good way of actually engaging with one's political, ideological, or philosophical opponents. And particularly when you're talking about thinkers who, yes, are difficult, but have a great deal to contribute, and at the very least would force him to check his own presuppositions with a little bit more rigor and a little bit more detail. So that's kind of my first more academic point. My second point is that I think it's unfortunate that he doesn't actually engage with a lot of these thinkers in more detail, because I think he'd realized that the left-wing critiques that he kind of dismisses offhand, especially by good thinkers like, say, David Harvey, or for that matter, Michel Foucault, can actually offer a lot of insight into the kind of problems that he's tackling. I mean, Michel Foucault characterized himself as a Nietzschean. Peterson often just dismisses him offhand, but the kind of Nietzschean insights that Foucault has in his work tell us a lot about what the consequences of the so-called death of God in the West have been when it comes to our institutions, how we set up society, the kind of things that we prioritize. And if you look at his work carefully, or even just superficially, because I think it's really a lot of it's right there on the surface, these kind of things can help us when it comes to trying to critique the kind of society that we've emerged now and the consequences of modernist secularism. And the same is true of a lot of the authors that Peterson just kind of dismisses offhand. And I guess this brings me to my third point, which is I think that the big gap in Peterson's analyses is he tends to focus almost exclusively on politics as a kind of psychological orientation. So I'll often say that people on the left are oriented more towards chaos and this desire to creatively transform society, whereas people on the right are more oriented towards order and this desire to preserve tradition. And the reason why he tends to support more classical liberal or traditionalist approaches, as he calls it, is he feels that the left has been too ascendant over the past few decades. So we've moved too far in the direction of chaos. And the result has been this emergence of a secular society where people feel unmoored and they don't have any sense of meaning, etc. But I think that the left actually has a lot to contribute when trying to interpret why this sense of meaninglessness emerged. And I think that this is where authors like Harvey or Foucault come in, because they would observe that actually far more than just a bunch of postmodern neo-Marxist authors, which really transform the way that people act and the way that we think, is living in a capitalist neoliberal society where even everything that is sacred can ultimately become commodified and transformed into an object that someone's going to sell. And you can see that across the board, for instance, with the commodification of religion in the United States, the emergence of these big mega churches that are just about making money. You can see it with the emergence of a very liberal sexuality and the marketing of a liberal sexuality as the way hip modern people should live. And of course, there's a related set of products affiliated with this. And you can multiply these examples almost ad infinitum. So this idea he has that somehow leftist postmodern neo-Marxists are responsible for the emergence of a nihilistic society that feels unmoored from its traditions is extremely naive. I think that actually we have to look at the material and social conditions that produce this a lot more than just individual actors, particularly authors. And I think the big target that we should be directing our attention at there is capitalist neoliberalism.
All right, then my question to you, a follow-up to this would be, let's assume Peterson's analysis is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But then what is the right analysis? What is postmodernism? What is this neo-Marxist doctrine? And I think it would be fair to say that somewhere down the line, there is a schism in Western society. And the left, again, I use this term as a broad brush, the left in the West has messed up.
Oh,
If they would
absolutely.
not have messed up, this would not have happened. There is something wrong happening. Now, obviously, if the left is behaving in a certain way, at the end of the day, the left is going to take their input from literature that does stem out of these authors or the writers who belong to this larger family. So, what is postmodernism? And then, in your view, what is that aspect of postmodernism that has been picked up and has messed up things in the West then?
Well, that's a very good question, and I need a very long time to answer it at length. So I'll just give you my kind of cold notes. I think that the late Mark Fisher and people like Slavoj Žižek are correct that most leftists post 1989, are closet Fukuyamists. They implicitly accept this idea that liberal capitalism is the only game in town, and there's really not very much that we can do about it. The only thing left for the left to do is to try and preserve what remains of the welfare states in advanced developed countries, and also to try to push for greater inclusion on the points of historically marginalized peoples. And I don't have a problem per se with either of these agendas. I actually think they're quite useful. But they are limited in capturing the imagination of the broader population and certainly being able to provide a more sustained critique of contemporary society. So that's a big issue right there. And when it comes to the issue of what postmodernism is, I think that this can be instructive when trying to develop a more sustained critique of the type that I'm talking about. So I think we need to divide postmodernism into two categories here. There are postmodern philosophers, probably the most exemplary of which is Jacques Derrida, who writes for the most part about language, never really actually wrote about politics very much until the end of his career. Then people like Michel Foucault. And the basic premise underpinning postmodern philosophy is that a lot of the more rationalistic ways that we believe we could interpret the world with some certainty are actually quite fungible, and they can be used to justify a wide range of different and sometimes even mutually contradictory positions. And the reason for that is, at base, there's a real problem with how we think of language. We believe that language can, in some sense, objectively point to certain things in the world, and that the point of, say, science, for example, is to develop a correct analytical framework where all the terms in a given discourse, as Foucault would call it, point to the correct things in the world with certainty, and of course the relations between them. And postmodern philosophy in this respect can be quite interesting, depending on how prone you are to accepting skeptical philosophies about knowledge and about ethics. Now, I'm not personally convinced, but it's very interesting, right? And I don't see postmodern philosophy in this respect as being fundamentally very different from other variants of skepticism or sophism of the type that you would see written in any number, discussed in any number of other Western texts. For instance, the Republic, right? Or the Sophists by Plato. These problems go way back. This idea that Peterson has at points that somehow this is all a new thing and that these skeptics are a big threat to Western civilization is a bit overstated. They've been with us for a long time. They're not going to go anywhere. There'll always be a new iteration of it to come forward. But the second way we can understand postmodernism, and the way that I am personally attracted to, is understanding it as a culture or as an epoch in the history of Western secular states. And I think as a culture, it's characterized by very specific dynamics that emerge in tandem with neoliberal society as it stands now. And of course, postmodern culture and neoliberal society are different in specific global contexts. So they look differently in China than they do in the United States than they do in Europe. But there are certain features that we can pinpoint of postmodern culture and neoliberal society that are constant. And I think these impact the way that politics is mobilized in highly developed or rapidly developing countries a lot more than postmodern philosophy does, which again is what Peterson tends, I think, wrongheadedly to focus on.
Now, I get what you're trying to say, but I guess this would be my counter to that. That if postmodernism focuses on language and the use of words and how those words express themselves eventually, it could be a very slippery slope in my view, where then how do we communicate with each other? I get it. I mean, I obviously am a classic case. I come from another culture, and I mean, if you look at Eastern dialectics or Eastern epistemology, let's say, I mean, I'm just using an example of Jainism right now. Like in Jainism, there is dialectic called Syadvad. Now in Syadvad, there is the way to derive answers for everything is never in a hard yes or a hard no manner. They say it could be yes and no sometimes. And I get it, and some things in life are not a strict yes and no, but then the person and the other side in my brain who wants to look at it from a purely evolutionary sense, that person would say no, but at the end of the day we are on team Homo sapien, so there have to be human universals. It doesn't matter if I'm born in Canada or America or in India or Pakistan. At the end of the day, there are going to be certain behavioral traits that are going to be consistent across cultures. I get the cultural play, but how do we deny the common biology that we share? I mean, where does one draw the line when it comes to this play of language? And at the end of the day, if there is no truth, how do we have a conversation then?
No, I mean, that's an excellent question. And again, I don't think we'll be able to settle it in the context of a short podcast. But I actually tend to agree with you. Epistemologically, at least, I'm a follower of what's sometimes called mature enlightenment. And when it comes to the philosophy of language, I'd say I'm most proximate, to the American philosopher Saul Kripke, who does believe that certain words, as he puts it, rigidly designate certain properties across all possible worlds with certainty. So, for instance, when I talk about gold, that always refers to the elemental properties of a given mineral, and that's gold, regardless of the kind of situation you happen to find yourself in. So I don't agree with the postmodern critique of language as I stated it, and that's kind of as a general outlook, not referring to any specific author here and there. So I think we should absolutely reject the kind of skepticism that some of these authors are propounding. But we can't do so just by talking about how what they're doing is undermining our quest for certainty, or it's making it more difficult to have a conversation, or it's undermining Western morality and the idea that we can have certainty of morals, right? That's just a kind of moralizing plea to bring the world back to the way it is. The only way we can actually confront these kind of skeptics is the way that Plato, for example, would confront them, by actually giving better philosophical and scientific arguments, for that matter, that indicate why it is that they're wrong in a descriptive sense, not just why the consequences of their argument lead to undesirable results. Because, of course, whether something leads to an undesirable result or not, if it's philosophically rigorous, then it might be true. And what we need to do is demonstrate why these things are not true in that sense. And I also think that there are aspects of postmodern skepticism that have been valuable in forcing us to think more carefully, certainly, about the way we use language and the kind of ambiguities that underpin language. And certainly poets and good writers in any number of different cultures have intuited this, right? Rather, like Heidegger would say, that language often speaks through us. We don't speak through it to point to things in the world. And I'll give you a good example propounded by Derrida, where he observes that oftentimes we see life as being in stark juxtaposition to death. And the terminology that we use to describe life is actually in stark contrast to the way that we talk about death. But he's going to say if we actually look at our everyday lives, the way we buckle our seatbelts, the way that we might refrain from certain activities like smoking, the way that we will tell our children to be careful when crossing the road, actually cognizance of death frames the way we operate in our lives in a very profound way, because we recognize our finitude and our mortality, and this is reflected in our everyday behaviors in very nuanced, interesting ways. So the kind of linguistic division between death and life that we posit and we rely upon for our understanding of these concepts is actually contradicted by our behaviors. And recognizing that can allow us a more deep and reflective approach to these different aspects of our lives.
So now I want to connect this to obviously the last article in your series of articles, which is I think it was on Quillette, if I remember correctly. I want to talk to you about postmodern conservatism. So I really enjoyed reading that because and I think you have to thank Trump's lawyer. Because truth is not truth has really nailed it, as they say, at least for your thesis, that there is a postmodern conservatism.
Yeah, I wanted to send Giuliani a thank you card for that, because I was like, more than any article I write, you've just vindicated me. So thanks, bud.
Yeah, I mean, literally, when I heard that quote from Yuri Giuliani, and I was like, oh man, Matt must be a very happy man right now.
Well, happy in the sense of that I was vindicated. Have you seen the movie Jurassic Park?
Yeah, I have.
So you remember there's the character played by what's his name? How can I forget? Anyway, he says something to the effect of, God, I hate being right all the time. And I'm not saying I'm right all the time, but it was certainly that reaction because, I was just like, oh, great, So this awful thing that I was worried was going to come to pass is now come to fruition, and I guess I can take a little satisfaction in the fact that I was right, while now having to be very worried about the consequences this might have for our future.
So my question to you would be now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to add one more caveat to this. So I would like you to explain what your theory of postmodern conservatism is, but I also wanted to ask you another question, and you can address the second one and then explain your thesis on postmodern conservatism later on. Is why do you think there is this movement of postmodern conservatism? To begin with, I mean, why has this come off in something like the right wing in America? Because I thought when it comes to the right wing in America, it's a very Christian worldview, and if someone were to look at a Christian ethos and the way Christianity is structured, it is a very black and white kind of a religion where there is the truth and there is only one truth. So for a culture that takes inspiration from a faith like Christianity, how do you think relativism can enter there? Is it more like a reaction to the left and they have basically imbibed those values themselves?
Yes, I think it is. And it might be worth noting that in the 1990s, when Margaret Thatcher was asked what her greatest achievement was, she said Tony Blair and New Labour, which is, of course, the party that replaced her. And the point that she was trying to make was that even her political opponents right now were kind of working and operating within the framework she had established. There was no going back to the kind of welfare state model that had preceded the rise of conservatism in the 1980s. And I think much the same is true with this emergence in postmodern conservatism. Postmodern conservatism did absolutely emerge in some senses as a reaction against the left, though I also think it's vastly more complicated than that. There are cultural and societal aspects that contributed to it as well, which we can discuss. But postmodern conservatism, as a reaction against the left, drew on many of the same kind of tactics and strategies as, say, left-wing identity politics movements. And you can see that in this appeal to a kind of white, Christian, Western identity as a locus for epistemic and normative authority. So you don't see people like Trump or Giuliani or any of their supporters like, say, Dennis Prager trying to construct philosophical arguments for why it is that, say, a Christian or a Western or a conservative worldview are correct. What they do instead is say that the left has antagonized people who hold these kind of views, and what we need to do is double down on them in order to preserve our identity and the set of values that are affiliated with that. And what that constitutes implicitly, and now, as you pointed out with this Giuliani quote, quite explicitly, is a rejection of the idea that these can be even challenged because they're based in that identity and the need to preserve it, not in anything that can be objectively ascertained and therefore criticized.
Now, this is again, I always say this when I have a conversation with someone in the West. I mean, I'm just an outside observer who's got no skin in the game in this whole saga. But it fascinates me, and I get confused at times with the whole process itself. uh, I have a lot of sympathy for Jordan Peterson and this whole thing that's unfolded in the West, and I'll tell you why. So when I look at it from an outsider, I just see this as a person. Let's say if you're someone who's white and who's born and raised after, say, 1980s or 1970s, whatever. Let's say the millennial white kid. I hate to use the race card, but I don't know any way else to frame this question. Now, what has this kid who's born after 1980s? What has this kid got to do with anything that his co-race people, I don't know how to phrase it any other way, have done? I mean, what is that person's fault? Why should that person have any sense of guilt for what has happened in the past? But you have this culture where you're beaten up, or not literally, but I mean verbally, you're basically being pummeled all the time. And I think the line has been crossed now, and you see a backlash. Because I don't think if the left would have gone far off, the right wing in America would have behaved the way they have behaved. I mean, I personally find the whole election and the victory of Donald Trump more as a rejection of this identity politics of the left than Donald Trump standing for something, because nobody knows what Donald Trump stands for.
Yeah. I know. I think you're absolutely right in some respects, and it's worth noting again. I'm was born in 1988. I'm Caucasian. I grew up in a Roman Catholic family in a conservative town in Ontario. So in some senses, I do get where Peterson is coming from. And of course, I went to a very left-wing university, And I'm progressive myself, self-identified. And I did find that this kind of virulent identity politics oriented around guilt is highly alienating. And I do think it has played its role in contributing to the emergence of postmodern conservatism in general and other kinds of right-wing reactionary politics as well. And I think the kind of response to Peterson, though, isn't to say that we should reject the left as a whole and the critiques and solutions that it offers, just because one strand of leftism that happens to be especially prominent right now is deficient or has made tactical mistakes or is just aggressive in tone and alienating in its consequences. I think the response to this would be to take somebody like, say, Robert Nozick more seriously and to say that, look, liberal theories of justice are predicated on the idea that you need to compensate individuals for sufferings or marginalization that they may experience that are morally arbitrary, that don't flow as a consequence of their actions. And I don't think that Western white individuals right now should feel guilty about what's happened in the past, since, as you mentioned, they themselves have not done anything to exacerbate that or to create those kind of conditions in the first place. But we do need to recognize that in many senses we remain the beneficiaries of systems of oppression that were designed to benefit us to the exclusion of everyone else. We are not responsible for that. We are responsible for trying to ameliorate the impact of that as it persists into the present day. And there are all kinds of examples you can point to in that respect, of course. You can talk about how it is that African Americans are incarcerated and tend to be poor at a rate that's very disproportionate to that of whites in the United States. You can point to the same with regard to Aboriginal peoples in Canada. Certainly in virtually any Western country, you can point to the marginalization of women in different spheres of life. And none of that is anybody who's alive today's fault, per se, but we are responsible for trying to fix it and actually make our societies more liberal, which in my mind, following somebody like, say, Rawls or Ron Dworkin or the Indian economist and Marcia Sen, for that matter, would actually mean making them more equal. So liberalism actually presupposes a greater level of equality than we have in society today.
Now, I want to read something off of your article on Jordan Peterson. I think it was the second article, and because this has something to do with the points you've mentioned. So you state in your article, and I'm going to quote you, his justifications seem to consist in realizing that life is unfair, hierarchy will always exist, and we must simply deal with it. He also argues that we stop resenting those who get ahead through merit and take responsibility for improving our lot. So, on the other hand, we have fatalism about the status quo, on the other, moralism about merit and getting ahead in contemporary hierarchies through effort. Now, I'll tell you why actually made the effort of reading this quote. I come from a I don't like to use the word third world, so I'm going to use the word developing country because that's what I believe we are.
Yeah.
So I come from a developing country, and I have literally seen change in my society after 1990s, when my society actually, my politicians decided to open up our country. We became more prone to free markets, and although our constitution still says we are a socialist republic, which I have huge problems with, but even if I was to leave my problems aside, I think good things have happened in my society post 1990. And yes, the byproduct of that is going to be an inherent inequality in society. What I wanted to ask you is, what is so inherently wrong with that? Because at the end of the day, no matter how much we hate it, there will be this gap in society. I mean, we will never be the same, right?
Well, I want to point out that I'm not opposed to inequality per se, right? Here we need to be quite careful. I'm not opposed to inequalities, for example, that are necessary in order to improve the lot of people who happen to be in positions of economic marginalization or even the middle class, because I think certain levels of inequality can, of course, incentivize greater levels of production, more hard work, and can help lift people from the bottom, as well as at the top above their current situation. So I'm not opposed to it in that respect. And I'm also not opposed to inequalities that flow from the exercise of certain natural talents and abilities that might allow us to get ahead relative to everyone else. Because I think that competition with one another in those respects is actually a very great good in human life. and we should, in some senses, encourage it depending on the field. So I'm not opposed to inequalities along those two lines. What I'm opposed to are the moralizing arguments that imply that if you happen to inhabit a situation in society where you are treated unequally or where you have less than someone else, somehow that's your fault. You haven't worked hard enough, you didn't commit enough labor, and I think that that's wrong, and I think it's wrong along a lot of metrics. And it's because what we're essentially doing is privileging certain natural gifts that individuals might have and saying that the exercise of those gifts by individuals that allow them to get ahead is more a result of the fact that they're better people and less a result of the fact that they're lucky. And I'll give you an example that you find in Peterson's text. So Peterson will often argue that IQ is a big determinant of the kind of hierarchies that we see in capitalist societies. And he may very well be right about that. I'm not sure. I'm certainly not an expert. But let's say that I have a higher IQ than some other person who might have a lower IQ than me, and this enables me to get ahead relative to that person. So I get into med school very easily, become a doctor, end up making six figures. This person isn't quite able to cut it and just ends up becoming, say, a janitor. Now, the problem with saying that that's justified on the basis of some kind of meritocratic logic is I didn't really do anything to earn my higher intelligence. And this raises significant questions about whether I'm entitled to claim all the reward that stem from having that higher intelligence. And the inverse is true for the person who wound up becoming a janitor. If this person really wanted to be a doctor and tried to become a doctor, but just wasn't able to cut it because they lacked the necessary mental equipment, is that their fault? No, it's kind of a genetic accident. And I think that if you actually take seriously this idea that IQ is determinative of positions in society, what it actually implies, along the liberal line, if we're trying to reward people on the basis of their merit, what they've actually done, is that the person who's gained a lot, who becomes a doctor, might actually need to compensate from a moral standpoint the individual who wound up with less. Because it's not that person's fault that they've wound up in that situation, any more than it's the result of good moral character or the extensive application of the labor that enabled this person to wind up in medical school in the first place.
You raise a very important point. So my follow-up question, which I want it to be the last question of our podcast, is now we've identified the problems and we kind of um, know what exactly is the where the gaps are. Now, how do we fix these gaps, and what in your view is going to be the role of the state? Because the battle, when it comes to the battle of ideas in the West, it seems to be based around what is the healthy role of the state to play in bridging this gap or bridging this inequality. I think everyone will agree that we all want a more egalitarian society. Now, I don't think so. Even the right wing would say that we don't want a more egalitarian society. But what do you think, in your view, is going to be the solution to this? In your that's what I wanted to end on, because I think at the end of the day we have to find solutions to problems.
Well, I mean, in terms of practical policy incentives, policy options, I think there are a lot of different ways that we can go about trying to create a more equal society. But there's no universal model that will apply everywhere. It really depends on the kind of country that you live in. But I'll give you a good example of the kind of policies I would like that actually is in India. And this is discussed by Amartya Sen in his book, I believe it's Development is Freedom, so don't quote me on that one, and his partner Martha Nussbaum. So they discussed the attempt to better educate girls in the province of Kerala in India, and they noted that the state government offered a financial incentive, I think it was like 600 rupees a day, for parents to send their girls to school for a 4-hour period. But what they noticed is that parents would often take the money and then immediately withdraw their girls from the school to go send them to work at a loom factory. So of course this policy wasn't working because the parents would just take the money, the state would have less finances to actually deal with other social problems, and girls still weren't getting educated. But what Nussbaum and Sen noted is the government switched tactics and started offering the girls a free lunch, valued at about 600 rupees, for staying in school at least for the morning classes. And of course, the parents would then let their daughters stay there at least until I think it was like 1 o'clock or noon or something like that. And that's the kind of policy that I think is actually a very good one for rectifying the major and unjustifiable inequalities in our society, because it was context sensitive. It recognized that you need to tailor this to the particular situation that you're dealing with, but it was also reflective of a more universal goal of ending patriarchy and rectifying the poverty and lack of education that's often affiliated with that. And what I'd like to see is similar policies, policies with analogous goals enacted in different Western and developing countries that are analogously context sensitive and that try to rectify the same kinds of problems. And I think that you can also talk about the role that international law might be able to play in the future, which is what my book Overcoming False Necessity is about, wherein we can set up a more robust set of international regulations that might enable us to prevent, say, the emergence of tax shelters, ensure that the wealthy pay their share in order to provide for more robust welfare systems that, again, are tailored to the needs of individual citizens in their given country, in different given countries.
Well, I hope that your suggestions are heard by the right people, and they do something about it. I mean, as far as my experience in India is concerned, is I have seen a very poor performance when it comes to the state level in India on a lot of issues. But at the same time, I could give you a very good example of a huge success with. I mean, you might find it interesting, so I'll give you another example of a midday meal scheme. So basically, in India, we had the scheme where to increase the attendance of young children to go to school, the government basically came up with an incentive that every young kid can go to school and they'll get a free meal. And that policy over the last few years has basically skyrocketed attendance of young children going to schools in India. So like I said, I like to call myself, if somebody from the West asks me what are you, I like to say I'm a reluctant libertarian, where my criteria is whatever is the efficiency level. If the state is able to do a job very well, then let the state do it. And wherever the state messes up, which in India they mess up a lot of times,
Yeah.
let the private sector take over. So I think you've made me think a lot. And after a long time, I was literally yearning for someone to give me good critiques of Jordan Peterson. So once again, I sincerely want to thank you for doing that, because I think nobody is criticizing Jordan Peterson the way he's supposed to be criticized, which would, I think, lead to a better society, because Jordan Peterson has played a very vital role. So once again, Matt, thanks a lot. And to everybody who's going to listen to this podcast, I'm going to leave a link for all of Matt's work on Marion West and Colette in the description of the podcast. So, along with his Twitter handle, I would recommend each and everyone who listens to this conversation follow him, read his articles. He's got a lot of interesting, things to say. So, Matt, once again, thanks a lot, man.
No, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I know it's late there, so I hope you have a good evening and a productive rest of the week.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.